Welcome back to the Boss Ladies podcast, hosted by myself and my co-host Manasi. Today we have Melissa, and we are so excited to have you. If you can introduce yourself, that'd be perfect.
Well, hi, my name is Melissa Berton. I am a high school English teacher, executive director for the PAD project, and producer for Academy Award winning documentary short, Period, End of Sentence. I am delighted to be here with both of you because I am very familiar with high school seniors, and I know from learning about both of you that you are the best of the best and you're going to make the world better. So I'm already inspired by what I've heard from both of you.
Gosh, thank you so much for that very uplifting intro. I love it.
True.
Yes, we're so excited to have you on, and it's funny that you talk about being a high school teacher because I think that's, definitely a great place to sort of start, and that was the start of your journey. You were a high school teacher before you started working in the menstrual equity space. So, I wanted to hear more about just your experiences with that transition. So, you were an English teacher for 10 years, and I'm sure that came with a lot of interesting experiences. Like, I feel like English teachers are just like the coolest teachers ever. So, I'm gonna give you that, but I think it's definitely not a background that a lot of people working in the menstrual equity space come with, working with English and working with students. So I'm curious how this background maybe contributed to your work, both in producing Period End of Sentence, but also your ability to, produce this documentary, what it looked like translating different stories, cultures, and like beliefs of these communities. So I'm just curious to hear maybe how your, experiences teaching English sort of bled into your work with menstrual equity.
Thanks for that question because it really has so much to do with how I got to this place. And it's not a question very many people ask. And I will tell you, and you may know this, I don't know what your reading lists are in both of your classes for English or as you've gone through the year. In my high school, we teach a class, or we taught at the time, a course called The Bible as Literature. That is, that we didn't teach the Bible from a religious perspective, but just more like, okay, what is the Bible telling us? Where is Western literature now? We also teach, I'm going to pronounce it wrong, but the Mahabharata, the Indian epic, we teach a play version of that to look at that origin story. And we also teach the Odyssey, an epic poem. This is all leading to something. In all of these beginning texts, the Bible, the Hindu epic, the Greek gods, the Odyssey, the women are very strong, but not treated super well in many of these texts. Periods are called the curse in the Bible. And things happen to women on account of their reproductive ability, their worth in society is equated to their virginity or their lack of virginity. They are wanted as reproductive vessels. So all of these things that I'm talking about didn't sit so well sometimes with my female students, and also with many of my male students. People noticed as we were reading these texts. So that is one background. Then students, very much like yourselves, approached me way back in 2013 to be a faculty sponsor of an organization that is interested in giving girls an equal voice to boys in the global movement for equal access to education worldwide. That group is called Girls Learn International. And as part of Girls Learn International, you go to the United Nations Commission on the Status of Women. And the feeling is it's very important to have young women, 16 years old is the youngest you can do, talk on the floors of the ECOSOC and of the UN about girls' rights. It was at one of these conferences, actually at the first one, that I went with my students, and we learned about this thing that is now called period poverty. Period poverty was not a phrase then. And for your listeners who may not be familiar, period poverty is the lack of access to supplies to manage your period. So that can be product. It is also the lack of access to clean and safe toilets and hand washing facilities and water, and lack of access to reproductive biology. So my students and I were angered, we were saddened, we were ashamed that we had never thought of this with the privilege that we had. We, got whatever products we needed. Yes, it was maybe a hassle or an inconvenience, but it was never something that prevented us from seeking our education. At that same conference, we learned about an inventor named Morgan Anthem who had made a sanitary pad making machine that could employ women and provide pads. At the same time, we were in communication with a partner GLI organization, Action India, whose students were attending a school near Delhi, outside of Delhi, and they knew of a community who wanted the machine. So my students and I decided we need to raise money somehow to get a pad machine for this village, and also to document it on film. Our idea was that maybe we could create an educational film that would raise awareness. 2013 plus 5 years later, 6 years later, then that's the film that went on to win the Academy Award and helped launch our nonprofit, the PAD Project. So I was talking a lot. You may have some questions to lace in there, but that's basically our origin story.
That was very well explained. I love that so much, and I love how everything really came together at the perfect time, and how this even one conference and one experience really just like, launched so many different projects and, long-term things. So I think it goes to show that, these conferences and gatherings of people from different backgrounds are super important. But I think you touched on this a little bit, but I think you sort of talked about how this trip was super life-changing because it was kind of the first time you heard about the term period poverty. And I'm actually curious to hear, and you did sort of define what period poverty, means to you, but I'm curious to hear maybe how your definition of period poverty has evolved as you've done this work, because I think that a lot of people who, might be a little bit familiar with period poverty just think that it is the access, lack of access to products. And that's definitely a part of it. But I think something you also mentioned was like reproductive biology and access to information. And that is like super prevalent as well. And I think that, infiltrates into a lot of different systems, such as like the education system. So I'm curious to hear maybe more about how your definition has evolved.
100%. And what I think is always most exciting and gratifying, sometimes angering, but always makes me feel like our work is important, is that even though menstruation obviously has been occurring since the beginning of humanity, because it's part of the reproductive process, this menstrual movement, this movement for menstrual equity, is really, really very young. So much has been happening just in the last 10 years. In fact, today, Scotland became the first country ever to have free period products, free for anyone who needs them. So how about that as a radical concept? The same way you might encounter free toilet paper if you go to a public restroom. So back to your question, how has the definition of period poverty evolved, excuse me. When I first began, we're called the PAD Project because that's just our name and because the machines were making pads, but really we are interested in all products. So for one thing that has evolved is the product market and what people who have periods might accept or want in terms of product. So sustainability is a great issue now, that we want our products to be biodegradable. That said, should we be putting the onus for 100% biodegradability on the most marginalized people in the world, that is young girls and women who are living in poverty? Should the onus for a fully sustainable pad be on them? That's another question. But ideally, We love sustainable options. So there's menstrual cups, which sometimes culturally are not accepted methods. There are washable pads, which require a climate that is dry and washing facilities. So there are all kinds of different products. That's one thing. And then the conversation around clean and safe toilets. If you are in a school in a rural area and the bathroom is miles away, like an outhouse kind of situation where it may be dark, it may be unsafe. Men have been known to wait in a predatory way outside of those restrooms. That is not, I would miss school. I would tell my daughter to miss school that day if she were having her period and I knew that she was going to have to walk to an unsafe bathroom to manage her period. So that's a barrier. And then Manasi mentioned the reproductive knowledge. That is so important. If you do not know what's happening to you, how scary is that to suddenly be bleeding from your body without any knowledge of what's going on? At the PAD Project, we have so many reports of young women who feel like they are dying. They don't know. They don't know what's happening to them. And also the stigma and the shame that is associated, like I mentioned before, in literature and over time with menstruating women, they're going to destroy crops. It's the curse. They can't go in the temple. They can't do this. They can't do that. All of these attitudes toward menstruation work toward inhibiting women and girls and people who have periods from participating fully in society. And that's what we want to work to combat.
I love how it's just also, again, related to empowering women in the sense, being able to be a full participant in society. And I think this is something that we've touched on earlier in our podcast too. Like, how do we make investments, or what strategies can we use to make sure that women are able to reach their full capacity? And I think that's part of why I personally find menstrual equity so interesting. Like, I didn't necessarily have a connection to menstrual equity before I met Modesty, honestly, but as I got into the space more, I found that there are so many interesting like returns on trying to solve this issue, and also just looking at the realm of reproductive health.
Yeah, definitely touching on that. I think something that, you said being a full participant in society, and even something Swalia said is like, we think about menstrual equity as an issue in and of itself a lot of times where give someone access to pad and okay, like the situation is over. But I think when you sort of empower someone with a pad or access, to a consistent supply of sanitary products or even hygiene and hygienic facilities to be able to, you know, even just go to the bathroom safely or change your pad or be able to put on your pad and things like that, you actually unlock so many different things. Like you said, if you had a daughter and she was sort of in that situation, you wouldn't send her to school. And so, when you sort of provide access to these products, you're not, only just providing access to these products, but you're also increasing the chance that girls go to school. And when girls go to school, they're increasing their economic potential and their ability to participate in society and be stakeholders in society and be decision makers and challenge that cultural stigma. So it's crazy to me, and it still, amazes me how much, focusing on the space of menstrual equity really unlocks, especially in a lot of these, marginalized and stigmatized communities.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah, and something else I was just curious about. I was looking into the PAD project, and I saw that the way that it had been funded was through the students at this Los Angeles high school. Were you a teacher there? I just was curious to hear more about that story, like how the students got involved with making this documentary happen.
Yes, that I still teach at Oakwood High School in North Hollywood, California. You hear the Hollywood in the name, so that is probably no accident in the sense that I think the community, it is an independent school and it's a pretty progressive school, I want to say, and I have a lot of respect for Oakwood School because when I came to the headmaster and the administration of the school in 2014, 15, hey, a group of students and I want to make this movie about, periods. they didn't say no. They didn't worry about a potential public relations issue. And I know from being in the educational space a long time that a lot of schools might not have been so permissive. And so I do give that community credit. And because of where we were very fortunate in the sense that um, parents of the daughters around us had been in the film editing community, knew things that I certainly did not know, and the students did not know. As an English teacher, about how to make a film, there were things that we needed to know on the PR side, how to launch a Kickstarter. We were just, I don't want to say making it up as we were going along, but we were asking a lot of questions, and we were fired up. And I think that that passion that the young people had, like you, to say, hey, this isn't fair, and this is what we're doing, and we're doing this, it caught on. And so it really did start, to go back to your question, it really did start with bake sales and yogathons. What was the game-changing fundraiser was we had a Kickstarter campaign. Are you familiar with Kickstarter? Do you want me to explain for your listeners a little about that and how that happened?
Yeah, feel free to explain a little bit because I'm not super familiar.
Okay, so again, for all your listeners too who have a crazy righteous idea that you want to go for, don't worry so much about what you don't know. If you know that your core value and what you're going for is right, keep going, and the answers will come. So I asked a lot of people, we wanted to raise money for two things. We wanted to raise money for the pad machine, which was $11,000. And we wanted to raise money to make a short film, which we had heard the cheapest we could do that was like $50,000. This is not, bake sales are not going to do that. We needed to raise $60,000. And we were flabbergasted. And so what we did was we asked people, and we learned that Kickstarter is a crowdfunding platform particularly used for film. So if any of your listeners are aspiring filmmakers, Kickstarter is a great place to go for film. And they also can crowdsource for inventions. So the pad machine is an invention, the film is a film. We made a joint Kickstarter campaign that if you're interested, you could still like go on Kickstarter and Google it, and you could see my students and I talking about making this film and wanting to raise money. And we got a director who had just graduated from USC, who was basically impassioned about this project. Her name is Rika Zatopshy. And she essentially agreed to do it for free. She was 22, 23 years old. She directed our Kickstarter, and the Kickstarter made 39,000 in its by day 3 almost. So, or no, I'm sorry. It made half of 39,000 was our goal, and it made half of it in 2 days. And it became one of Kickstarter's quote unquote projects we love. So that means there's a community of people who like to follow Kickstarters and like to contribute. And that's when I think we had the first inkling that this is an issue. No surprise, right? Because half the population will menstruate and spend a lot of their time menstruating in their lifetimes. But the success of that Kickstarter campaign was one of the first inklings that we had that this is an issue that people care about, and we're just going to keep going for it. So to answer your question, we did 2 Kickstarter campaigns, and we continued with the bake sales, with the yogathons, and we had the good fortune of a great organization, the Feminist Majority Foundation, being our fiscal sponsor. That meant that, this is getting a little complicated, but in case you all want to do something like this, that meant that if somebody with more means was going to donate something like $500 to the pad project, they could get a tax write-off because the Feminist Majority Foundation was a nonprofit. At the same time that we did that, we started the wheels in motion to create the PAD Project nonprofit. The PAD Project, as a nonprofit organization, and now we work in 15 countries all over the world, was almost funded as a nonprofit overnight with the Oscar win. I woke up to an avalanche of emails, many of which were small donations, but so many from all over the world, $5, $10, $25. And that's what helped gave the PAD Project the seed money to like kind of launch our nonprofit.
That is amazing, and I love that also the students had such an integral process in all of this because it really just
Absolutely.
feels like it is coming from young women, and, I just love that you have been able to champion young women throughout this process because I know high schoolers have a lot of experiences and a lot to say on this subject, so definitely
100%.
feels like a crowd you wanna, bring into this, something like this, but it's also really cool to see how much support you got from so many different platforms and how that was, indicative of the fact that like, oh, this will be a successful project. And it isn't a surprise and it shouldn't be a surprise because so many women go through this. But I think when, we sort of keep topics like this under wraps and we don't talk about it often, it's easy to forget how many people really, do care about this issue and, are constantly just thinking about it and, hurt by it as well. And there's so many people, even in our own country, even in the US, that continue to struggle with issues like this, especially, this past summer, I was looking at immigrant youth in particular, and like there's a whole range of needs and issues that they have that, policies don't support, but then also actual, pediatricians, people, don't fully understand, given that, their situation might be a little bit different. And then, of course, cultural stigma and financial barriers and all of that. But I think just on the whole, it's really, interesting to hear how your students played a really important role in propelling this project off of the ground. And I also want to talk a little bit more about, your documentary and what the, filmmaking process was, because I think this is just a very unique film in so many different ways. But I think one of the things that makes it super unique is it's so focused on the community and so focused on the people and the stories in that community. And I'm really curious to hear, were you on ground for the filming process? Were you not? And sort of how did that coordination really look like?
Thank you for that question. And also, I want to give you a shout out for working and thinking about the the immigrant community, because that is asylum seekers and refugees and immigrants are a group of people who definitely need menstrual products. The PAD Project has partnered with Border Angels because we're in Los Angeles to Border Angels is this wonderful nonprofit, shout out to them, that provides water and stuff in the desert for people coming to the US-Mexico border. And so we help give pads and stuff like that for people who are crossing or in detention centers. So side note on that. Then back to your question about the film. So it's a really good question that you asked, and we determined pretty early on when we first had the idea for a film, we had no idea what that film might be. We thought it might be a conversation between the students in Los Angeles and the students we were working with in Delhi. And we quickly realized it was very important to have the whole story set in Kathikera in that village. And we wanted to, this is another place where English teaching comes in telling a story, whether it's in literature or in film, you want to see something happen. So we understood that it wasn't much of a story if the machine had already been there. We wanted to capture what the attitudes of the people in the village were like toward menstruation before the arrival of the machine, and then give it some time. We gave it half a year to see the effect of the machine in the village and go back and film that. So The filming was done in there were 3 visits to India. The filming was done in 2 main time periods. One was our director, Rika Zatovsky, and Sam Davis, her now partner, cinematographer, went to India. They went alone. The reason why is because no Western persons had ever been in that village, much less with a camera, much less speaking a different language. So we wanted to do, even though, so there were 3 entities, and I'm sorry for the long explanation, but there was all of us at Oakwood School. There was Action India, wonderful nonprofit with whom we still partner in Delhi, that they speak English and Hindi, and they were our partner. And then there was the community in Kathikera, spoke only Hindu, had not been out of their village. So Action India was the liaison between our Oakwood and our filming crew and the community in Kathikera. So Action India worked with the community to prepare for the arrival of Rika, our director. And Rika had what's called a line producer who did the translation. And they did some filming. We identified our subjects. I know you both have seen the film, so you know who Sneha is, the aspiring police officer. And I still remember getting the emails from Rika. I just met this woman, Sneha. She wants to be a police officer. I think she's the focus of our film. And then they filmed some and then came back and filmed again to see the progress of the machine in the village. And then I went with my students to screen the film for the first time, screen a first cut for the women in the village, which was a profound experience for all of us. And we were so, because we knew if they didn't like the film, we couldn't move forward with it. But they loved the film, and they were able to come. Many of Sneha and Suman, in whose house the pad machine was, they were both able to come to Los Angeles to be with all of us for the Oscar ceremony, which was super exciting. For them, it was the first time they were out of the village and then all the way to Los Angeles. So it's been kind of crazy. And a lot of people ask, well, did Sneha become a police officer? What's her story? And what happened with Sneha and Suman is they became women's rights advocates and advocates for menstrual equity. And so they travel through India talking on panels and being spokespeople for menstrual equity.
That's so fascinating. I really
Yeah.
like that. That's such a heartwarming story. Also, just to see how the impact you guys chose to initiate it, they chose to continue it. Like it made such a lasting impact on them. It became something they thought was worth pursuing, and I just find that so wonderful that the impact continues to grow even outside of the pad project itself. It's not just like a one-time thing. It's long term.
I hope so. Yeah. Thanks for that.
Yeah, just adding on to that, and I think that it's so amazing that even just, this one idea and pursuing it and the fact that you were able to pursue it has, launched not only this film, but, a nonprofit that's working globally, but then also a lot of other people that have been inspired by your work and have also, continued the impact specific maybe to their countries. And, you said that they're working in India, and I think that's like super relevant and like very, very amazing. And, it's very hard to do something globally, especially when you're, sort of, in the US, and it's hard to coordinate. And especially, a barrier you mentioned was just like access to language. And then just like, they hadn't seen a lot of, foreigners. And so for them, it was like, how do we sort of, ease into this community and make it, a respectful filming process, not just, on your end, but also for them, right? Like making them feel welcomed and, feel like they can trust you and actually open up and share their stories with you. And I think when you're working, especially with the rural community, it's really hard to establish that trust and really hard to, tell people that this is like safe and this is being conducted in a safe manner. This is for your well-being, and we're, not trying to endanger you in any way. So I can only imagine some of the struggles that came with that. You sort of outlined, that the tip of the iceberg a little bit, but it's just so amazing to hear how, the process was set up so it was respectful on everyone's end, and also sharing that moment where you watched the film with them and you got their approval, because that's also super relevant as well. And I'm so glad that you had to have that got to have that shared experience with both your students, but then also this community. Um, and so focusing a little bit more on the pad project, I want to ask, it is so impactful, and like you said, you're working in 15 different countries, but I think it's really great that you have been able to, optimize not just for, like distributing this pad machine, but also focusing on, longer term benefits. And something we talked about earlier in this episode was a lot of these long term benefits aren't just, being safe and hygienic, but also, access to education and being empowered and being employed and things like that. So I'm curious to hear, although this is definitely newer, and in your organization, how maybe you've already been able to see some of the longer term benefits of producing these pad machines and distributing them.
Yeah. So we it's interesting. So we got right before COVID hit, we had pad machines on the way to several different regions in India, to a woman's maternity hospital in Afghanistan, and to Kenya. Those machines are finally there and starting to be up and running. So I feel like we have a little bit of a lag in terms of knowing how well the machines are producing. That said, Action India, where the film, the northern India, where the film is set, they now have 2 new machines that are semi-automated. They deliver pads to schools all over Delhi. So their pads are called fly pads, like in the film, but they have new packaging now, very beautiful. And they sell all over. I think the pad project as a whole, last time I checked, had produced, given, granted over close to 400,000 products somewhere around the world. And this has to do with our washable pads, which are reusable. So we have washable pad programs in Kenya, Uganda, Ghana, Guatemala, and then we have pad machines in Afghanistan, in all of the different north, south, east, west, India, and Kenya, Sri Lanka, and we have in the US, and your comment was really well taken about period poverty and menstrual poverty in the US. I'll never forget an email that I got the morning after Oscar. I live in Compton, that's an area in Southern California, and I have to put socks, dirty, old socks when I have my period. Can you please send me some pads? So this is a story we hear over and over. So we're very proud to have a Pads Across America program, a Pads for Schools program, where we work to put products in schools. We partner with the Period Company, which does period underwear. So lots of different products, some reusable and some disposable, to try and help people manage their periods.
I really liked hearing how you were able to also create change within our own country, like within our own state also, because I think sometimes we, I don't know, frame menstrual equity in a way that it's mainly an issue in a developing country, or not something that's close to us. So I think that was like really impactful, that even locally, of course, this is not just a faraway issue, it's something that's very real for most of us.
That's so important. And certainly this is not a regret, that's the wrong word, about period end of sentence. But one thing that I never want to lose sight of is that period poverty and menstrual inequity is everywhere in the richest communities as well as the poorest. And I'm really proud and excited. Our next film coming out, keep an eye out for it, is called Long Line of Ladies. It's making its way through the film festival circuit, and it's set in Northern California in the indigenous community, the Karuk tribe. They have coming of age ceremonies where periods are actually celebrated as a rite of passage. And it's a really beautiful film about this ceremony that's sort of the opposite of looking at a period as a source of stigma, but looking at it as a source of pride for the whole community, because another member of the community has come into her full power as an adult. So it's a really remarkable film, I think.
So I just wanted to comment on the fact that you are, actively exploring different cultures, and I think it's really valuable because we often I think that, the film that you're, producing is, obviously on a group that, isn't very, discussed, and we don't really think about, indigenous tribes, but I think they also have really interesting stories in all of these different cultures that you have been able to explore, not only through the PAD project working on global work, but also just through your film and really highlighting and showcasing what these cultures look like and not just talking about them, but actually showing them and showing these stigmas in action and through the language and beliefs that a lot of these members of communities have, but also on the opposite, showing how members of these communities actually value periods, and not just writing about it or talking about it, but actually showing it in action. I think is super powerful and creates a new heightened awareness where we read something and it's easy to forget, but when we see something, it's not so easy to forget. So I just think that's really beautiful, and it's just a beautiful form of showcasing an aspect of different cultures.
Thank you. That was so lovely put, if that's a word, lovely.
Something else I noticed while I was watching the documentary was how not only did the women produce their own pads from the pad machine, but they were also selling them. And they were talking about how one thing was that women aren't always comfortable like buying period products from men. Something else was just their pads are actually higher quality, even though they might not have looked as aesthetically pleasing as the other products on the market. And I remember one of the women talking about how part of her dream was just to see like the fly boxes in all of the stores across India and everything. And I thought that was so cool. And I'd love to hear more about how your team or people who are working on the documentary thought about the economic side of selling the period products and what the women experience was actually selling them.
Thanks for noticing that. And it is like a little startup, right? And one of the things, there are so many kick-ass, if I'm allowed to say that on a podcast, I think that's okay, organizations that are doing so much. You mentioned some before we got on the call that are doing so much for menstrual equity and women's rights and girls' rights and all of that. One thing that we are very proud of at the PAD project is the social entrepreneurship aspect. So we really want women and girls to have agency. That's why, for instance, the fly pads are in Action India. We have Anasi pads. That means, I'm forgetting what ANASI means, but it means something wonderful. But each of our organizations makes and names their own pads and markets them. So we have all kinds, and then our washable pads have different fabrics and colors. And so it's part of, I think, the creativity, the agency, the ownership, and also part of the challenge. We have to figure out every country where we work is different, every community. So what is going to be the business model? What is the supply, need versus supply? This is when I needed to be an economics teacher, not an English teacher, but there's definitely like a lot to figure out in terms of how do we sustain it. It's not that we want or need people to make some huge profit, but we want the women to make the wages. We want it to be sustainable, and we want people to have access. So how can the PAD project grant funds in such a way and knowledge where the community will be sustained on their own if the pad project, goes away tomorrow, which we hope it doesn't. But you know what I mean? So we want the communities to know how to sustain their business enterprise.
I think that's one of the reasons that I just see the pad machine as such a really very cool invention and very sustainable, like you said as well, because it's not just making the pads, but it's also providing a source of income for women. And so that allows them to, purchase more materials and find more customers and then, in turn produce more pads, not just for their own well-being, but also for the well-being of others. And the fact that, everyone profits from this, it lifts a community woman from the ground up is really magical. So I just love how that there's so many, dual benefits to having this invention in a community where, women are not just being, empowered with their reproductive autonomy, but also economically empowered and also, building a network in a community of people that can even, have access to dialogue to talk about these issues. And I think just the benefits are astounding.
Definitely.
Something else I was curious about is where did the pad machine originate from? Like, did someone invent?
So at the time that we procured the pad machine, it was around 2016-17 when we actually figured out how to get the pad machine. Morgan was really the only one making this pad machine, or one of the only ones. And he is an incredible person because he did not patent his machine intentionally, because he wanted other people to be able to make the machine. And since period, end of sentence, and since a movie Padman, with a big Bollywood actor playing the part of Morgan Anthem, the idea of pad machine has been really popularized. So it's become a cottage industry all over India where there are different pad machine vendors. And there is one in London that we work with. So right now, and this is something that a brilliant, MIT, one of you is going to invent, we right now can only source machines to South Asia and to East Africa, because that's where the inventors are. We have so much need from South America, West Africa, South Africa, desire for the machine, but right now it's just not possible to really ship it there because none of the inventors or vendors are there.
It's really interesting. And something else I was thinking about now that you mentioned the pad man was how there were also men that were working these machines, and how I think like one of the men in the documentary like had worked on like creating and like making the pads more accessible. And I was curious to hear like what change did you see in the communities that the pad project worked in, between how men had thought about menstruation, if they had thought about it at all.
It is very much like you see in the film, and I was glad that we were able to capture that arc. It's so true that at first people thought they had to say it was a Huggies diaper machine, because that was more acceptable. And once the pad machine had lived in the village for a while, some of that stigma went away, and the uncles, fathers, husbands were actually proud that their wives, daughters, sisters were making this wage, and they wanted to understand what it was. And they became involved and wanted to make the pads. There was a moment we didn't capture on film, which we were sad about just because it was dramatic. When the machine first came in the village, there was one of the men was very upset. Like, what was this? Distrustful, didn't want the women to be gathering together at odd hours, felt threatened. And he came drunk one night and tried to like destroy the machine. Later, he came around and was, very friendly about it. And we met him in very pro machine, but there was resistance, just as there always is. I think Suman in the film says, whenever there's patriarchy, things take a long time to change. And I think that just the presence of the machine in the village, people making money, having purpose, all of that helped to destigmatize menstruation and to interest the men in being part of it. People have asked, and it's interesting, culturally in different communities, some of the men are still very much in charge of the business enterprise or organizing the women around the machine, which can feel very frustrating when, the whole point is to give women agency and ownership. But you got to start where you got to start. And each community is different. And there are some wonderful men who are really taking up this mantle, and that's great because we need male allies, absolutely.
Yeah, I
We
really love
absolutely do.
And I just remember this one scene from the documentary. One of the women was talking about how usually brothers get things for their sisters, but she talked about how she got an outfit for him and he came and visited her. She said, "I'm the sister that gave my brother something." And I thought that was a very beautiful moment.
That's the moment in the film that never fails to make me cry. Yeah, she says, today I bought my brother a suit. Usually a brother buys a gift for a sister, but today I bought my brother a suit. Yeah.
Yes. Just yeah, the only other thought I had on my mind was after going through all of this experience, like working on period end of a sentence, how do you think about how important it is for high school age students to get engaged in their communities like this and think about solving these types of problems? And yeah, how would you even give advice to teachers or educators on like why this is so rewarding and valuable to have this sort of experience at this age?
I can say that I learned so much from every teacher knows that the teacher is really learning from the student, and the student is my students made me so much braver than I would be. There are areas where I discourage my students from speaking out because I thought they would be targets of being made fun of, being shamed, so like the mama bear overrode the teacher bear. So I would say, no, don't talk about periods at an assembly, or don't do this, don't do that. And my students would say, no, we are. And they did. And they were right. And I wouldn't have known that. I would have stopped that. And I've learned so much from following the bravery and what your generation won't accept anymore. Your generation is like, I'm not going to be embarrassed about a natural biological process. And it sounds like a small thing, but it's really a radical thing. And I think that they have been, I don't know, rewarded sounds like it's a material thing, but it's not. They've been rewarded too, just with all the relationships that they have made that they never would have made. I mean, we're still in touch with the communities in India with which we work, and more communities and more people, and they're active. I certainly can't do like our marketing and our Instagram. I can't figure all that stuff out, but they figure that out. So it's opened up avenues for them to see their own creativity, to build new relationships, collaborate, experience leadership. So it's really been exciting and inspiring. It's not to say we haven't had our squabbles and troubles and challenges. It's all part of it. But overall, it's been an amazing, arc. Like, oh my God, crazy.
That is so beautiful to hear, and I think the last question I actually have is, just something that's been also on my mind recently, and I think that given that you have a very global lens and you have worked on projects, not just in film, but also worked with communities, made a global impact, all of that. I'm curious to hear what you sort of think successful interventions or strategic investments in the space of period poverty look like in the long term. So, just a question I have is how do we take a community first and grassroots approach while also, really aiming to impact as many women as possible and impacting as many women in as many countries as we possibly can? Because sometimes we, want to do the most that we can for a particular community, but then how do you do that, but then also do that for a lot of different communities? And what does that sort of look like?
Wow. I hope that both of you will come when you are in college or out of college, come work at the PAD project, because those are the very questions that we are asking, and they're hard questions. And the strategic intervention for different communities will be different. And also, how do we evolve with the changing times and the changing thinking and still be receptive to our communities? I'll give you one example that is more a language thing rather than a business thing. But you both are probably familiar with the term menstruator, yes? Okay.
Yeah.
So when we first, well, not when we first, okay, menstruator was not a term until about, or that I knew, that we knew until about 2017, 18. Then around there, people stopped saying girls and women when referring to having a period because it was trans exclusive. People thought you're not accounting for non-binary trans people, people who don't identify as women and girls. So we were like, yeah, makes sense. So we fully embraced that term menstruator at the PAD project. Then very recently, we've been getting a lot of feedback that menstruator feels like it's reducing a woman to her reproductive parts, particularly from communities of color. Also, that term menstruator is not apprehensible to, I don't know what word, comprehensible to the communities that we work in that are international. So in other words, they can understand girls and women, but they can't understand menstruator. People in America felt like that term was just insulting, like we're all robots menstruating. So then we went back to girls and women, and then we got called out for being trans exclusive and not including everyone. So there is no good answer to that issue right now, but to kind of go back to your larger question of what is the strategic intervention with each community and how do you do it, I think that just we have to keep listening, keep evolving, and try to not give up even if we're not perfect. So you know, we may not always do the exact right thing or have the right language or address a sensitive situation in the perfect way, but we have to trust that the basic, and I would say with any philanthropic nonprofit social justice kind of work, I would encourage people to trust that if the what you are trying to do is good and you know it, if it's good, then don't be super hard on yourselves if the approach isn't right from the get-go. I mean, it's really hard, and we do not always get it right. But the point is to keep trying, because the cost of not doing anything is a lot greater than the cost of doing something. I hope that made sense.
That made total sense, and I love that point about how, it's not something you can figure out, immediately, but as long as you are doing something, you are still doing something, and that's sort of
Yeah.
what really matters, especially in this space when, like you said, especially with menstrual equity and period poverty, every successful intervention looks completely different, and even, with the films, right, with period end of sentence, this community in India saw periods very differently than this tribe that you're working to create this
Yeah.
new film with. So
Yes.
even just the cultural attitudes and the way people see things redefines what a successful intervention will look like. And so I think it's important that we are staying personal and focusing on a community level, just as a basis. So I think this is a good place to wrap up the episode. Thank you so much, Melissa. I learned a lot just about your
Thank
work
you to
and your
both of
views in
you. You're
general.
both amazing, and I hope you will keep in touch.
Yes, thank you so
Thank you
much.